Ruby Ridge is first tonight. A Senate subcommittee began hearings today into the ill-fated siege in northern Idaho 3 years ago. 3 people were killed in the confrontation between federal agents and a white separatist and his family. Betty Ann Bowser reports.
Raise your right hand for the administration of the oath.
Randy Weaver said he thought this day would never come, when he would have a chance to tell his version of the events that unfolded near his home in northern Idaho in 1992. It was early morning. Federal marshals were doing surveillance around his property.
On August 21st, 1992, federal marshals shot my son Samuel in the back and killed him. He was running home to me. His last words were, "I'm coming, Dad." They shot his little arm almost off, and they killed him by shooting him in the back with a 9mm submachine gun. The gun had a silencer on it. He was not wanted for any crime. He did not commit any crime. The marshals killed his dog right at his feet. He only tried to defend himself and his dog. Sam was just 14 years old. He did not yet weigh 80 pounds. He was not yet 5 feet tall. The marshals who killed Sammy were grown men. They were in combat gear. They had their faces painted with camouflage. They were wearing full camouflage suits with black ninja-type hoods. They were carrying machine guns and large caliber semi-automatic pistols. They were trained to kill.
Weaver first got into trouble with law enforcement in 1989 when he was charged with selling 2 sawed-off shotguns to an undercover agent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. When Weaver failed to show up for trial on those violations of federal gun laws, U.S. Marshals were ordered to bring him in. For months, they watched activities around Weaver's cabin at Ruby Ridge. On the morning of August 21st, 1992, the family dog Striker discovered the marshals in the bushes and began barking. Gunfire erupted. Before it was over, 14-year-old Sammy Weaver and a federal agent named William Deegan were dead. Kevin Harris, a young man who lived with the Weaver family, was with Sammy. Inside the cabin were Weaver's wife, Vicki, and his 3 daughters, Sarah, Rachel, and 10-month-old Elishaba.
Pretty soon this other shooting started, and I'm thinking, I got to get back down there. The boys are involved in this. And I tried to reload my 12-gauge shotgun, and I jammed the stupid thing, so I threw it down on the ground, and I drew my 9mm pistol out, and I fired 3 times. I said, "Sam, get home, get home." I heard him yell, "I'm coming, Dad." And I thought, good, that's great. And I headed on, I kept moving up the hill toward home. And there was a few more shots fired. And here I am back up in the yard, and I'm waiting, I'm yelling, "Get home, Sam, come on, Kevin, get home, get home." And pretty soon Kevin comes walking up the road, and we yelled at him and said, "Where's Sam?" And he said, "Sam's dead." And we just went berserk. All of us, we just lost it.
The FBI hostage rescue team was hastily summoned to take over after the shootout at Ruby Ridge. And although it is still unclear today who approved it, FBI officials at the scene were operating under rules of engagement that allowed them to use deadly force against any armed adult observed around the Weaver cabin. And one day after Randy Weaver lost his only son, he and Kevin Harris were shot by an FBI sniper on August 22nd. Vicki Weaver was shot and killed while standing behind this door with baby Elishaba in her arms.
Switched my rifle from my right hand to my left hand, and I reached up to turn the latch, and I got shot in the back. Shot through the shoulder, and first thing was, that hurts like hell. Second thing was, they're going to shoot me again. Sarah come around the edge of the building. She says, "What happened, Dad?" And I said, "I've been shot." She says, "Get to the house." She started pushing me, turned me, get to the house. And Vicki had come outside in the yard. She said, "What happened?" I said, "I've been shot, Ma." And she says, "Get in the house, get in the house." And she jumped back on the porch and opened the door. And as we went running through the door, there was another shot. And loud boom right there. And I'm just inside the door off to the right, and by the time I turn around, I hear a commotion behind me. And Rachel's standing right over here, about as far as I am from that thing there. Rachel's 10 years old. Rachel's 10 years old. Vicky was turned around, laying down on the floor with her head in a kneeling position with the baby underneath her. Kevin was sprawled out on the kitchen floor, clear inside the door. Vicky's head was about at his feet, and the girls were screaming. I went over and picked the baby out of Vicky's arms and checked her out. She had blood in her hair, and she was all right. It was like she was, can't remember how, it was like she had shock. And I handed her to Rachel and checked Vicky. She was just, when I picked her up and over, she just like a wash rag. She was gone.
Weaver and Harris were tried for the murder of federal agent Deacon in 1993 and acquitted. At their trial, Ron Horucci, the FBI sniper, testified he accidentally killed Vicky Weaver. But Weaver told the committee today he doesn't believe that. He was questioned by committee chairman and Republican presidential candidate Arlen Specter.
Your contention is that he deliberately and intentionally used one bullet to shoot both people, Mr. Harris and Mrs. Weaver.
Yeah. But I believe he was trying to take my wife out first and hoping he'd hit one of us three going through. That's the way I see it.
Why do you believe he was trying to take your wife out first?
He had orders that he could and should. Any adult.
Throughout today's hearing, Weaver's 19-year-old daughter, Sarah, was a visible emotional presence, and she backed up her father's testimony that the FBI sniper had to have seen her mother standing behind the door.
She was standing right here, right in the window, holding it open, holding the baby, saying, "Get in the house, get in the house."
And she was shot here?
Yes.
And you saw her in that position as you were running toward her?
If I had taken one more step, he would have got all three of us, because I felt everything just hit my cheek. I thought I'd been shot, because the sound travels with the bullet, and it sounded like the person was standing right where you, or right behind. It sounded like it was right there.
How long would you say that your mother was standing there in that position in the door?
The whole time it took us to run from that shed into the house.
How long would that have been approximately?
Approximately 10 seconds. I really couldn't tell you. I'd have to go up and do it over and time it.
Do you think she was visible through the glass at that time?
I do believe she was.
Why do you conclude that?
Because I remember the curtains. I remember having to close them.
One senator characterized Weaver as no poster boy, pointing to his ties to the Aryan nation and his belief in the separation of races. Chairman Specter questioned him about that.
Were you a white separatist, and what does that mean as you understand it?
Well, sir. Chairman, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what to me separatist means is a couple different things. Number one, I am not a hateful racist, the way most people understand that. But I believe in that if there's separation of the races, scripturally speaking, that's what I believe is right. It sounds like an impossible task, and most likely is, but I believe that every people of every race should be proud of who they are and what they are. There are good people in every race. There are bad people in every race. We had beliefs that, if there ever was a natural disaster or downfall of the government or whatever, we wanted to be separated from the rest of the world. We didn't want to be a part of it. Survival, you might call it. We wanted to separate out and be able to survive, any bad times ahead, if there were going to be.
Tomorrow, the subcommittee will hear from officials of the ATF, the agency that first brought charges of federal firearms violations against Randy Weaver.
Now, today's Ruby Ridge hearings. A Senate subcommittee continued its investigation into the 1992 federal siege in northern Idaho. Today, senators heard from officials of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Correspondent Betty Ann Bowser reports.
Like Waco, the chronology of events, now known as Ruby Ridge, began with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Guns. In 1989, the ATF charged Randy Weaver with selling 2 illegal sawed-off shotguns to an undercover agent named Kenneth Fadley. Today, members of the subcommittee wanted to know why Randy Weaver became a target of the ATF. Special Agent in Charge Herb Byerly and his boss, Assistant Director of Enforcement Andrew Vita, testified the ATF believed Weaver was a major illegal gun dealer.
On October the 11th, 1989, Mr. Weaver stated to the confidential informant that he wanted to go into business with him by supplying the confidential informant, who had the persona of being a dealer of illegal weapons. Mr. Weaver stated to him that he wanted to go into business with him. They had a discussion on the type of firearms that were the best sellers for the confidential informant. The confidential informant stated an array of guns, including shotguns. Mr. Weaver then asked the confidential informant, well, what size? The confidential informant said, the shorter, the better. Mr. Weaver then told the confidential informant that he could supply 4 to 5 of these per week to the informant.
Would you describe what you believe to be a significant threat of violence, what that was?
Yes, Senator. I was given the information by the sheriff that each of the Weaver children possessed firearms. They were well versed in how to use these firearms, that they even slept with firearms, that if we were to attempt to arrest Mr. Weaver in the presence of his children, that there could certainly be a threat to us or to them or to the Weavers themselves, with the children using the firearms to prevent the arrest of Mr. Weaver. I had information from a neighbor who had been providing me information for almost 6 months concerning the activities of Mr. Weaver, where he and some of his associates were using firearms to shoot over their residents, to intimidate them with firearms. These are some of the things that came into play with the information that I provided to the U.S. Marshal Service.
Mr. Byerly, it is clear, isn't it, that after all is said and done, the total number of illegal firearms that were transacted between Mr. Weaver and the ATF were 2 sawed-off shotguns?
Yes, Senator.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yes, Senator.
Is it also true that you had no knowledge of him having sold illegal firearms to other people?
That is correct.
So then, rationally speaking, how do we come to the conclusion that this man is so dangerous in terms of his propensity or probability of becoming a major firearms dealer, that you would decide that in fact he was in fact such a dangerous person from that respect, when if in fact the total number of transactions was no more than 2?
There were only 2 sawed-off shotguns which came into the hands of ATF through the confidential informant.
Yes.
But there was information coming from Mr. Weaver's mouth that he could supply up to 5 sawed-off shotguns per week.
Well, then why didn't, if that were true, and you really wanted to have a case that you wanted to be certain of where you're coming from, which we expect from people in your position, why wouldn't you have pursued it to the point where, in fact, he was and had become a major firearms dealer? So we wouldn't have to be talking about whether or not. He, as you know, will deny that. He said, I only sold 2, and a question about how that happened. And he's right in terms of fact. He's not a major firearms dealer. You're suggesting that he could have become, but he wasn't. And you were in control of that whole operation to have made it, in fact, the case. So do you understand our concern
Yes.
about
Yes,
accepting
Senator.
that conclusion that you are putting forth with respect to Randy Weaver, ... major firearms dealer? It's not true on the basis of fact, is it?
There were only 2 firearms which were received by ATF. That is correct.
I think you try to make out a better case than you've got here. When you try to portray Weaver as a major supplier, it appears to me that the only source you've got for that is your paid undercover agent, Mr. Fadley. Isn't that the case?
In the monitored conversations that we had, yes, sir.
In what?
In the monitored conversations that Mr. Fadley
Well,
had.
I've looked at those conversations, and it raises a question. The main conversation, when he supposedly laid it all out, is to, number one, the fact that you have to take the word for your paid informant, that he was approached by Mr. Weaver instead of the other way around. Number two, the detail in which the deal was structured and the amount of arms that could be supplied. All of that was not recorded. Then when you get to the recorded conversations, there's nothing in there that indicates that Mr. Weaver is some kind of a regular or massive or has any history as far as an arms dealer that I can see. What I do see is Mr. Weaver saying here in this conversation of October the 24th, he says, when I get my workshop set up, I can do a better job. And then the informant says, all right, now you said for $150 you could do pretty much 4 or 5 a week, couldn't you? And Weaver says, well, and then the agent picks back up again. They never get back to it. It's pretty apparent what you're talking about here is a fellow sitting out under a shade tree with a hacksaw. And it just depends on how many he can saw as to how many he can supply. Isn't that the case?
Well, that could be your interpretation.
Well,
Vita elaborated in a separate exchange.
Mr. Weaver also presented a profile that is very consistent with major firearms traffickers. They indicate that they have an unlimited source of supply. They indicate that they have firearms that are available to us that are not maintained on federal firearms licensees' records, which Mr. Weaver did. He indicated that he could supply us a continuous quantity of firearms. He also indicated that those weapons could not be traced, which is very consistent with somebody who's involved in criminal firearms trafficking.
Tomorrow, representatives from the Federal Marshal's Service will be questioned about their role in the 1992 shootout that ended with the deaths of one of their agents and Randy Weaver's 14-year-old son.
Now, day 3 of the Ruby Ridge hearings, a Senate subcommittee continued its investigation into the ill-fated federal siege in northern Idaho. Among the witnesses today, an undercover informer. Betty Ann Bowser reports.
A paid informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms named Kenneth Fadley testified from behind a screen. Away from television cameras, his voice altered electronically.
And he has made the personal request that he be permitted to testify with the screen so that his identity will not be disclosed.
Fadley's description of Randy Weaver was in sharp contrast to the portrait Weaver painted of himself. The undercover informant characterized Weaver as a racist who was deeply involved in the Aryan Nation.
We again talked about minorities in this country in a negative manner. We talked about some religious organizations and their followers in a negative manner. And basically the whole day was filled with how to get a patriot movement started, how...
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I didn't hear that last bit. How to get a patriot movement started?
How to get a patriot movement started, how to organize ourselves into a group that would fight against ZOG, Zionist occupied government. That conversation involved the fact that the Jews were controlling the United States government through legislation that was not to their liking, that they controlled the banking and financial communities that was not to their liking, that the Jewish community, going back to some religious context, was creating an atmosphere where the white man did not have the power, the financial...
When you say the what man? The
white man.
The white man?
They blamed...
Well, wait a minute. Aren't Jews white?
Well, I always thought so, but they certainly don't. I would characterize Randy Weaver as a proponent of racism, of hate towards minorities, an individual who, if he had the opportunity and he had the means, would be very violent towards those individuals and towards the government of the United States of America.
Fadley told the subcommittee that in 1989, Weaver told him he could supply the informant with illegal sawed-off shotguns all day long on a regular basis. That same year, Weaver sold the informant 2 illegal weapons and was indicted on federal gun charges. Critics of the government's role at Ruby Ridge claim Fadley set Weaver up. Committee members wanted to know about that.
You in no way ever raised the issue of making illegal guns or sawing off shotguns to Randy Weaver, that all of the impetus for this came from him. Is that your...
Sir, I am emphatic that I did not at any time coerce, bribe, sway Mr. Weaver to do any criminal act. That the criminal act that he did, the sawing off of the shotgun barrels on those 2 weapons, were originated and done solely by Mr. Weaver and Mr. Weaver alone.
In the past, Fadley has told conflicting stories about how the ATF paid him for his services as an informant. At Weaver's murder trial in 1993 on charges of murdering a federal agent, he testified he would receive more money for information he supplied if Weaver was convicted. Weaver was acquitted. Fadley now says he misspoke.
Why didn't you call the attention of the Assistant U.S. Attorney to your incorrect statement, which you testified under oath at trial, that you assumed that you wouldn't get any money if Mr. Weaver was not convicted?
When I misspoke, and I realized I had misspoke, I didn't feel it was my place to say, wait a minute, that's not what I meant.
Well, why not? If you say you misspoke and you knew you misspoke, why wasn't it your place to tell the Assistant U.S. Attorney you had misspoken? How was he to know you had misspoken if you didn't tell him so?
There was an assumption on my part, sir.
What was your assumption?
That Mr. Hohen knew how I was to be paid, and that Mr. Hohen would subsequently direct this issue to its proper conclusion.
Well, when Mr. Hohen didn't proceed to redirect, why didn't you call it to his attention?
I couldn't find Mr. Hohen.
ATF Director John McGaugh told the subcommittee it is not Bureau policy to pay informants based on successful convictions.
I can tell you clearly it is not a payment for conviction.
You can go back through our records and look. In fact, the $2,500 that he was paid way earlier was not for a conviction. There was no conviction in that case at all. There was just a lot of information that he was able to bring forward.
McGaw was not director of the ATF at the time of the 1992 Ruby Ridge incident, but said his review of it shows no ATF agent acted improperly.
Now the Ruby Ridge hearings. A Senate subcommittee began a third week of hearings into the federal siege in northern Idaho. Today, senators heard from the top FBI agent at the scene. Betty Ann Bowser reports.
When the wife of white separatist Randy Weaver was killed by an FBI sniper on Ruby Ridge in 1992, special FBI rules of engagement were in force. Rules that instructed agents they could and should use deadly force against armed adults around the Weaver cabin. Ever since the incident, there have been questions about those rules, why they were developed, and who approved them.
I do.
Eugene Glenn, the FBI special agent in charge at Ruby Ridge, told the subcommittee today that his boss, then Deputy FBI Director Larry Potts, approved the special shooting rules.
In your judgment, who gave the approval?
The highest authority that I know of was Mr. Potts. I discussed the rules of engagement with him after I had been told under the circumstances in which they were drafted. I discussed them with him, and I don't know of anybody at a higher level who would have been aware of it.
You say that Assistant Director Potts told you that, or you discussed them with him. He knew what the rules of engagement were. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
They had formulated them on the airplane coming to Ruby Ridge, had they not?
Yes, sir.
Also in the shooting report, as I understand it, that was compiled after this incident, the shooting report actually acknowledged that FBI headquarters approved these rules of engagement.
Yes, sir.
Did it not?
Yes, sir.
In fact, didn't Assistant Director Potts in a sworn statement acknowledge that he had approved the rules of engagement?
Yes, sir.
Well, do you understand now that his position is different?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Potts was censured by FBI Director Louis Freeh for his role in Ruby Ridge, but Freeh later promoted Potts to the agency's #2 position. Glenn, meanwhile, complained to FBI officials that he and other agents had been unfairly punished for their involvement, while Potts was rewarded. It was all, he said today, part of damage control at FBI headquarters.
Do you think, Mr. Glenn, that part of the answer for that is that you are being scapegoated for this whole mess?
The way circumstances have ended up, I do believe that if the FBI is a competent investigative agency, which we've proved ourselves to be for years, that has to be a theory that would be set forth.
In your opinion, is part of this scapegoating also part of what may appear to some to be a cover-up?
I have a feeling, and it's just my belief, that there were damage control assessments that took place. And maybe we could say that the ship saw some hungry sharks swimming close by, and they decided that they would put a few tuna out there and see if they could satisfy them.
FBI Director Freeh recently demoted Potts and suspended 4 other of Glenn's bosses for their role at Ruby Ridge. Those same 5 are being investigated by federal officials for possible obstruction of justice.
The subcommittee will resume. We have under subpoena Special Agent William Gore, Special Agent Richard Rogers, Special Agent Stephen McGavin, Special Agent Lester Hazen, at the request of a counsel who purports to represent all of them, we have elected to proceed at this time without requiring their appearance in court.
As the committee looked for more information to shed light on Agent Glenn's testimony, it was stymied this afternoon when attorney Brendan Sullivan showed up representing 4 subpoenaed FBI agents. Sullivan told the committee his clients will not appear, claiming Fifth Amendment privileges. This is the second time that's happened. Last week, the FBI sniper who killed Vicki Weaver refused to appear, also citing Fifth Amendment considerations.
Now the Ruby Ridge hearings. A Senate subcommittee continued its investigation into the fatal federal siege in Idaho. Correspondent Betty Ann Bowser reports on today's proceedings.
When the FBI took over operations at Ruby Ridge, Idaho in August of 1992, Eugene Glenn was special agent in charge. Dick Rogers was head of the FBI's hostage rescue team, and their boss was then FBI Assistant Director Larry Potts. Ever since the events at Ruby Ridge, there have been contradictions over what these men said to each other as they drew up special rules of engagement. Those rules allowed agents to use deadly force against members of the Randy Weaver family. Yesterday, Glenn told the subcommittee Potts approved those rules of engagement. But today, Charles Matthews, the man who was in charge of the FBI's administrative review of Ruby Ridge, disagreed before a skeptical Senate subcommittee.
Now, how can you come to the conclusion that there was no headquarters approval if you don't ask Special Agent Glenn whether Associate Director Potts approved the rules of engagement in the context where we know now that Mr. Glenn said Mr. Potts did approve the rules of engagement?
Senator, I found that the preponderance of the evidence that was on record established that the rules that were issued on site were different from the rules that were discussed with Mr. Rogers as he flew to the crisis site with Mr. Potts. That Mr. Potts, in 2 signed sworn statements, has advised that he discussed with Mr. Rogers that the rule of engagement should allow that agents could use deadly force when they observed armed individuals around the crisis site. However, they should avoid any confrontation with children, and that if a confrontation is unavoidable, then the standard deadly force policy would apply. That rule is not the same rule that was issued at the crisis site. The 4-paragraph rule that was issued at the crisis site, the one that would direct agents to act unconstitutionally if they acted under that rule, the best evidence available reflects that rule was not approved at the headquarters level. That rule was approved on site.
When you started this investigation, of course, Mr. Potts was your superior, was he not?
He was I believe he was assistant director of the criminal division.
Well, I don't mean in a line, but he had a superior position than you, if you don't mind me putting it that way, within the organization. Was Mr. Potts reprimanded because of any conclusions that you had in your report?
No, sir.
Part of your job was to make recommendations with regard to discipline with regard to those who you thought needed it.
That's
Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And you knew that Mr. Potts was involved in the entire handling of the affair, and you knew Mr. Colson, as his assistant, was involved in some way as you went into it. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
And you had a personal relationship with Mr. Colson, do you not?
More professional, but I know him, yes, sir.
I mean, you had served, as his assistant in Portland in 1988? You were ASAC when he was SAC there?
Right, for 2 years.
For 2 years.
2.5 years.
All right. So you were put in the position of theoretically having to recommend a discipline to someone who you had served as number 2 in command in the Portland office in 1988.
That's correct, Senator.
All right.
Matthews also defended Ron Horucci, the FBI sniper, who shot and killed Vicki Weaver under the special rules of engagement.
The conclusion I reached was that the FBI sniper observer who fired the 2 shots did not fire the shots pursuant to those instructions. Indeed, he fired those shots consistent with the FBI standard deadly force policy. He only discharged his weapon when it was time to save lives, and that's obviously consistent with the standard deadly force policy. Now, as to the second shot, I found that the second shot was also consistent with the standard deadly force policy, realizing that you have a requirement of dangerousness, necessity, and the provision of a warning order or a surrender announcement if feasible. The dangerousness is established. The necessity is the aspect that the sniper observer had to make in that split second between the first shot in defense of the helicopter and the second shot as who he believed the same person was running back into the cabin. The subject that he fired at had not thrown his weapon down, had not said, "I surrender," had not stopped movement that was consistent with aggressive behavior. He maintained his weapon, and he was running for a better position. I know of no rule that requires law enforcement officers to cease and desist firing at a subject when they simply move from one position to another to obtain a strategically better location to continue an engagement.
In separate testimony, Fred Lansley, an FBI negotiator at Ruby Ridge, told the subcommittee that in 300 hostage situations, he had never seen such severe rules of engagement.
I didn't view the rules of engagement as being, let me put it another way, I thought they were wide. I thought it was an expansion of the FBI's use of deadly force policy.
Would that not put them in the category of being the most severe that you'd seen in the all?
I'm sure it was. Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. How did you reach that conclusion that you thought that they were the most extreme you had seen?
They just were. I mean, I'd never heard of rules of engagement that permitted what was allowed at Ruby Ridge.
Tomorrow, the subcommittee will hear from former FBI Assistant Director Larry Potts, who is currently under investigation for criminal wrongdoing in the aftermath of Ruby Ridge.
Finally, the Ruby Ridge hearings. For 3 weeks, a Senate subcommittee has tried to pin down who authorized the rules of engagement that left 3 people dead in northern Idaho. Those rules instructed federal agents that they could and should use deadly force against armed adults. Correspondent Betty Ann Bowser reports on today's proceedings.
George Terwilliger, the man who was number 2 at the Justice Department in August of 1992, told the subcommittee he didn't know about Ruby Ridge until it was over because he was on vacation. But he said he believes now the rules of engagement were a mistake.
The could and should language was clearly an error. There may well be a legitimate question as to whether it was an exercise in good judgment to express these considerations in the manner in which they were formulated in the rules of engagement at Ruby Ridge. It is relatively easy, especially with the benefits of time and expertise in drafting documents, to second guess on that point. But whatever one's judgment on the level of articulation contained in the draft of the rules, I believe there was no intention to counsel the use of excessive force.
Yesterday, former Assistant FBI Director Larry Potts denied he approved those rules of engagement and said documents being withheld by the Justice Department could prove he was right. Today, Barbara Berman, who authored the Justice Department's task force report on Ruby Ridge, was asked what she knew about those documents.
Why was the task force not able to resolve the question of who approved the rules of engagement?
Senator, we found insufficient documentation to make a final conclusion on who approved what rules of engagement. Until, I believe, yesterday, we were unaware of the written communication by Mr. Potts in which he recorded his approval of some form of rules of engagement on August 21st.
Why were you unaware until yesterday?
I can't explain that, Your Honor, other than we requested all documents be provided to us for purposes of our investigation, and in February of 1994 even had, through a letter from Mr. Shaheen, a request for the Bureau to do another sweep of all records to see if there were any official or unofficial documents available on the subject.
Do you have any sense of what documents are the ones that Agent Cahill has reportedly admitted shredding and were unavailable for your review?
No personal knowledge.
And, in preparing your task force report, did you speculate or hypothesize what might be in those documents?
Senator, my experience with the FBI is that they are very meticulous note takers. They are very thorough. They are very conscientious of the record keeping that they make of things. There was a significant absence of corrections to the records when there were errors in the Strategic Information Office records, in the logs, and things of that nature. We could not explain why there were no records available for us to look at that talked about when the rules of engagement were approved by headquarters, what rules of engagement were in effect. The rules of engagement were in effect, as has been noted by this body, from the 22nd of August until the 26th of August, and yet inexplicably no one at headquarters admits to having been aware of what the rules were or having read them.
Berman's task force concluded the rules of engagement were not only unconstitutional, but led to an excessive use of force. Former FBI Director William Sessions told the subcommittee he does not believe one of his agents, Lon Horucci, should have fired the second shot that killed Vicki Weaver, and he disagreed with previous witnesses on another point.
We've heard of a lot of situations in which FBI and HRT have been involved, and yet yesterday we heard that this was the most dangerous. To your knowledge, during your tenure, how was this elevated, or how was it viewed as an episode or an event compared with others?
I know it's a very serious and was a very serious circumstance, but I do not think about it as being the most dangerous that the Bureau has ever encountered.
I believe that was it was in reference both to the Bureau or the experience of the agents involved and HRT. I believe it's been said in those contexts.
Well, HRT has been in extremely difficult circumstances for extremely long periods of time, and certainly this is a high category of difficulty, but I would not think it was the most difficult they'd ever encountered.
Sessions also told the committee he was in South Carolina when the Ruby Ridge incident took place and does not recall ever being asked to approve any rules of engagement.
The Ruby Ridge hearings. For 4 weeks, a Senate subcommittee has been investigating that shootout in northern Idaho. Witnesses today included one of the survivors. Kwame Holman reports.
28-year-old Kevin Harris described himself as a close friend of Randy Weaver's, almost part of the family, he said. He lived with the Weavers off and on for 9 years, and this morning told the Senate subcommittee that the week leading up to the siege at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, was typical.
We had no idea that the deputy marshals would be in the woods on that Friday. In fact, I really didn't believe that the marshals would come up and try to arrest Randy. I figured that they would just wait him out.
What's bothering me is everything we have received indicates that there was discussion, that the family had talked, that there was an agreed upon position by the family with respect to coming off the mountain and or being arrested. And the decision had been made not to come off the mountain and not to submit to arrest.
I knew about all that.
Did you ever ask, why don't you go down and get it straightened out?
Yeah, he thought he'd be railroaded if he did, by the way things were coming about.
And you agreed with that and didn't advise him perhaps to go down and get it straightened out, to surrender?
I didn't say those things, no. They had already made their decision when I got up there.
You knew about the decision then?
Not
You
to
knew
go to court, yes, ma'am.
And so what did you think would happen? Because you were there then. Clearly, you were
Right.
going to be a part of whatever had happened. What did you think it was that had happened, would happen?
I was going to be a part of what happened. I never thought I didn't think they were coming up. I figured that sooner or later Weaver would get tired of being up there and he'd turn himself in. I thought they were just playing a waiting game.
But Harris said on August 21st, 1992, he, Randy Weaver's son Sammy, and the family dog stumbled upon a team of U.S. Marshals taking surveillance photos to build a case against Weaver. They exchanged gunfire. Sammy was killed, and so was Federal Marshal William Deegan.
I was still walking forward, and the dog was jumping around the man. The dog then moved away from the man in a circle and ended up facing uphill. Suddenly, the dog was shot. My impression was that the man near him was the one who shot him, but I can't be sure of that. I watched as the camouflaged man ran into the brush. Sam stopped above the dog. As I came up next to him, he started to raise his weapon and said, "You shot my dog, you son of a bitch." As soon as he started to raise his weapon up, I turned to my right and headed for cover. I took 2, maybe 3 steps, crouched down, found some cover beside the woods. There were still shots being fired, and so I fired once into the brush. I believe that whoever was in the woods was shooting at both Sam and me. I heard a dull hissing sound like a thip, and right away I heard Sam yelp. It was the kind of sound you make if you were slugged in your chest with a fist. I didn't hear anything from Sam after that. I heard moaning from the woods and someone saying, "I'm hit, I'm hit." There was someone standing up, leaning over something, probably a person. The person standing up said, "I know, I know." Then this person jumped onto the road and said, "U.S. Marshals, U.S. Marshals." This was the first time I'd heard anyone identify themselves.
Well, who do you think they were? Who did you think they were?
At that point, I didn't think anything. I was just trying to get out of the way.
And you thought you were firing in self-defense in that context?
Yes.
You've testified that you gave a statement to the FBI. Let me read you a paragraph from the FBI report. Harris raised his rifle and fired so quickly that he did not get his rifle up to his face or actually have anything in his sights when he fired. Immediately after firing his rifle, Harris heard a man moan and say, "I'm hit." Doesn't it sound to you like you fired the shot that hit Deputy Marshal Deegan?
Yes.
Harris then explained to the committee how the next day he was wounded and Weaver's wife Vicki was killed.
As I started through the door, I heard a loud boom. I was looking at Vicki, at her face. As I heard the shot, it was as if there was something moving under her skin. Then her face was deformed, almost seemed to explode. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor. When I couldn't feel my left hand, I realized I'd been hit.
Harris already has been tried and acquitted on the charge of murdering William Deegan. Now Harris is suing the federal government for $10 million. The Ruby Ridge hearings continue next month.
Now some perspective on the 4 weeks of testimony thus far from 2 members of the subcommittee. The chairman, Senator Arlen Specter, Republican of Pennsylvania, who's also a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, and Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat of California. Senator Specter, do you feel you now know what happened at Ruby Ridge that day and why?
Yes, Jim, we pretty well know what happened. We had the federal law enforcement officers come up there to take Randy Weaver into custody. When we questioned Mr. Harris today, I think that it came through that they really knew that federal law enforcement officers were going to come there at some time, although Mr. Harris denied that. We saw the tragedy. You can see it in Kevin Harris's face when he talks about it, but we have seen that the FBI had rules of engagement which violated the Constitution. They said that deadly force could and should be used when they saw an adult male with a weapon, which is contrary to what the Supreme Court of the United States has said. The FBI denies that those rules of engagement played a role in the killing of Mrs. Weaver, but the Department of Justice Task Force said that the shot which killed Mrs. Weaver was unconstitutional. And we also saw...
Let me stop you right there, Senator. Sure. And for those who haven't been following it that carefully, what did the Supreme Court say, and what did those rules of engagement, how did they violate what the Supreme Court said?
The Supreme Court says that there must be an immediate danger of death or bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, for deadly force to be used. And the rules of engagement
Not necessarily on the agent, but to anyone, is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Could be to anyone.
Anyone, all right.
And the rules of engagement said, and let me make this plain, that even FBI Director Freeh says the rules of engagement are unconstitutional, but he denies they are causative. Mm-hmm. The rules of engagement say that if you see an adult male, that deadly force could and should be used. It's really shoot on sight if you see someone carrying a weapon.
Yeah. Senator Feinstein, do you agree that with Senator Specter's knowledge level, that you now feel that you know what happened and why?
I think the senator expressed it very well. I basically believe, there are some very good things that federal law enforcement has done. You look at the World Trade Center and the investigation, Oklahoma City and the investigation. But this was clearly a mission that went awry. And in going awry, really there were unnecessary deaths. I think the rules of engagement are at the center of it.
And you think those deaths were caused by the actions of federal law enforcement officers, not by the Weaver
No, not entirely at all. I think, as I understand the chain of events, and the chairman will give his understanding, the dog was probably shot first by one of the marshals. Then, I believe, Sammy Weaver shot, and that began the firefight. And then Marshal Deegan was shot, most probably by Mr. Harris, based on what we have. And then it escalated from there with Sammy Weaver running home and being shot again, this time fatally. And that was the 21st. And it's the 22nd then when the FBI sniper observers came onto the scene. Mm-hmm. And they were following something that, in my experience with law enforcement, I have never seen. And that is a supplement to whatever the deadly force policy is. A supplement that, by their own testimony, the FBI has said, was very rarely ever used. That essentially said, for any armed male on the scene, they could and should be the deadly force used. Now, I think it has to be remembered that Mr. Weaver had no prior criminal record. He was not a murderer. He was holding no one hostage, where one might look at a rule of engagement that would be different if you were a sniper and you were holding somebody hostage, and then there might be a reason. But in this case, I think the rules of engagement really provided an obfuscation and quite possibly an enhancement of the deadly force policy. In my own mind, and this is my conclusion, I don't believe that sniper observer Horauchi would have fired those shots had it not been for the rules of engagement. He testified that that was not the case, that he was following deadly force.
Senator Specter, do you believe that it was the actions of the federal law enforcement officers that caused the deaths? One thing led to another, led to another. If they had acted properly, nobody would have died that day?
Well, I think a substantial amount of fault here lies with Mr. Randall Weaver in refusing to comply with the order to come to court. Had he come off the mountain, none of this would have happened. But then there's a step behind that, and that is that Randall Weaver originally sold 2 sawed-off shotguns, which the jury found he was entrapped on. And if you have 2 sawed-off shotguns, that ordinarily is not a federal case. But Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms said that Randall Weaver had prior convictions, which was untrue, and was a suspect in a bank robbery case, and the director of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms characterized those misrepresentations as inexcusable. So you had a whole chain of events for the great tragedy, but Randall Weaver was a major causative factor in what happened, because he could have interrupted the chain. Had he come down, his son and his wife would not have been killed, and Deputy Marshal Deegan would not have been killed.
Senator Feinstein, another suggestion, there's been a suggestion that the FBI and the Department of Justice may have been less than forthcoming. Even the word cover-up has been used after the event, preliminary, before your hearings, etc. What's your judgment on that, or do you have one?
Well, I'll be very candid with you. My judgment is this, that agents on the scene passed up the chain of command, these enhanced, and that's my word, rules of engagement. And someone should have approved them. Former FBI director, remember this all happened on another watch, former FBI director Sessions said that the appropriate thing would have been for the number 2 or possibly the number 1 man in the criminal investigation unit of the FBI to have approved those. And I very much believe that to be the case. At least it would be, I think, in any city police department in this nation, that before something different from the ordinary is going to be done, that this be passed up the chain of command and approval be secured. Now, there is real controversy around that, and one of the things that many people had thought is that Mr. Potts did approve it.
Mr. Potts was the deputy FBI director at the time.
That's correct.
Right.
Did approve those rules, and then later said he did not. I believe in my heart of hearts that he did approve those rules. And I think that we're looking forward to hearing Director Free testify, because I think many things came out in this hearing in terms of the approval process, communication, chain of command, procedures that really need careful review. And I think the Department of Justice and the FBI are going to move as a product of these hearings, or have already, to make some changes.
Senator Specter, Director Free is going to be your next witness, is that right, when you reconvene the hearings, is that correct?
He will be a witness soon, yes.
Yeah. What is it that remains to be done from your perspective?
Well, the issue of cover-up, which you asked about, has been conceded by the FBI, where the FBI has said a critical document was shredded, destroyed, and 5 suspensions have been ordered. But what we're really looking here, beyond the placing of blame, which responsibility has to be established, but that's not nearly as important as correcting these procedures and making sure that deadly force is not used in violation of the Constitution. And Director Free told me that the FBI field offices are under this cloud, and what we want to do is get to the bottom of it, see who was responsible, and see how you correct it for the future, because law enforcement is very, very important in this country, and we do not want to cripple or hamstring law enforcement, but federal law enforcement officers have an obligation to enforce the law against violent criminals, enforce the criminal law, but also to uphold the constitutional law, and we want to see that the procedures are made correct.
In light of that, Senator, there was concern going into your hearings that Randy Weaver, an admitted white separatist and an alleged violator of weapons laws, would be made into a hero, and federal agents would be made into villains by your hearings. Has that happened?
No, I think that Randy Weaver is not a hero by any means, nor is Harris, and I think that we have seen some areas that have to be corrected. We come out with the conclusion that law enforcement is vital, but it has to follow the Constitution. We have the longest record in this country for stable government because we have a Bill of Rights which are observed in a theme running through these hearings is that there's a lot of distrust of government in America, and we want to show the people that accountability will be affixed to whatever level is appropriate, and that the government will respond to protect individual rights and to protect people against violent criminals.
Senator Feinstein, do you believe these hearings have been constructive thus far?
Oh, I think they have. What Ruby Ridge did in Waco, to a certain extent, I think, is instill in a lot of people a real notion that they can't trust law enforcement. And that there is this notion out there, and it does get reinforced from time to time. When that happens, the important thing is that people stand up and take responsibility and do something about it, and that the truth comes out so that you can make the corrections. The purpose of these hearings, as I look at them, isn't really to cast blame. It really is to see that as we go forward, there is the systems, the procedures, the leadership, the command present, so to speak, that will prevent these things from happening in the future. And I think that's very important, because in our democracy, a lot depends on the support of the people.
Well, Senator Feinstein, has that element been missing thus far on Ruby Ridge? A federal official come forward to you or to anyone else and say, look, I made a mistake. I was responsible. I blew this deal. And has that happened yet?
Well, in my opinion, there were people that were very candid. I think Agent Glenn, who could have taken the Fifth Amendment and didn't, because he wanted to bring forward very clearly his part, and I thought he did so, quite honestly, and he's taken his censure. Director Sessions came before us, and I felt he was very direct in saying what he thought should have happened, and clearly what didn't happen. But what I have seen is a big gap between those in charge in Washington and those out in the field.
Right.
And that's one of the things that bothers me.
Does that bother you too, Senator Specter?
It does, Jim, but we haven't finished yet. A very, very big question yet unanswered is why, in the face of all of this, was Mr. Larry Potts promoted to the #2 man in the Department of Justice? And that is a very big question which has yet to be answered.
And thank you both, senators.
Glad to
And
be with you.
when are your hearings start again? When are you going to reconvene them?
We'll reconvene them. We hope to finish up appropriations this week and take a week of recess, and then back about October 10th, and we'll go right back to work and finish them up as soon as we can.
All right. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now excerpts from today's Ruby Ridge hearings before the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism. Elizabeth Farnsworth reports.
Crossed out.
This morning, suspended Deputy Director of the FBI, Larry Potts, reappeared before the Senate subcommittee. He was called again because the subcommittee had received crucial documents about the Ruby Ridge case from the Justice Department. Those documents were not available when Potts first appeared before the subcommittee a few weeks ago. The information concerned the controversial rules of engagement that Potts and FBI agent Dick Rogers worked out during the federal siege of white separatist Randy Weaver's house in 1992. Potts says that he never approved of the can and should language that appeared in the final operations plan at Ruby Ridge, where a federal agent and 2 members of the Weaver family were killed. Today, Senator Dianne Feinstein told Potts that based on the documents, she now believes Potts was telling the truth.
Mr. Potts, I have a small confession to make. When you testified last time, I must tell you, I thought, I don't believe him. Since then, I've had an opportunity to review your notes, and I want to correct my thoughts. I do believe you. I think I know how it happened, that there was a difference of opinion, but I have concluded in my mind that you did not sign off on the language can and should.
It was my impression that we were, that he was reading from what he had prepared. And he had asked at the end of the conversation, Larry, would you mind making a record of that there? And I said, I'll be glad to.
A record of
our agreed rules.
Right.
And I said, I'll be glad to, which I did. I mean, if I had it to do over again now, once Rogers arrived in Idaho, I would have faxed this to him.
So bingo, that
so
was the problem right there.
Well,
in other words,
certainly was.
He and you apparently had a miscommunication.
But other members of the subcommittee remained strongly skeptical of Potts' story and the way the entire operation was conducted. Senator Larry Craig asked Potts whether Agent Horiuchi, who was responsible for Vicki Weaver's death, was under the impression that he should operate on a shoot-on-sight policy.
It is interesting to me that when the rules of engagement say could and should, and his responses to that line of questioning are absolutely consistent with those heightened rules of engagement.
Right.
That he understood them to mean it was his job to shoot on sight armed adult males. And he did.
You know, these things are not given nor received in a vacuum. And I mean, that I just want to make sure that you talked about the training, and I do think that that's an important, I mean, I'm very sincere in believing that that's an important factor.
And you should be.
I also believe that the mission concept is an important factor. That, you know, they understood that the mission was to secure that inner perimeter so we could begin to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
The rules of engagement are not just handed to people and say, here's your rules. There's hopefully, with the on-scene commander and the HRT commander, discussion of those rules within the context of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
I don't see how you could have a rule of engagement interpreted as shoot on sight when what we're trying to accomplish is secure a perimeter and negotiate.
In the afternoon session, the subcommittee heard from Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick. She announced new policy guidelines that were developed as a result of the shootings at Ruby Ridge.
We have revamped dramatically the way in which our law enforcement agencies and the department responds to crisis. The FBI has created a critical incident response group, or a CIRG, for managing crises like Ruby Ridge. And the CIRG establishes a clear chain of command within the FBI. It ensures that the FBI's senior leadership, including the director himself, has responsibility for crisis management. In 1992, as you have heard, the then director was only peripherally involved in the incident. The second major area is the deadly force policy. In 1992, the Department of Justice did not have a uniform written deadly force policy applicable to all law enforcement agencies. We do now. Under the new policy, law enforcement and corrections officers may use deadly force only when the officer has a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent danger of death or serious physical injury to the officer or another person. Deadly force may not be used if an alternative reasonably appears to be sufficient to accomplish the law enforcement purpose. Moreover, the FBI director has abolished the use of rules of engagement altogether. As I have noted before, the rules of engagement adopted for Ruby Ridge were so poorly worded that they could have been interpreted to direct agents to act contrary to the Bureau's deadly force policy.
Gorelick was asked if this new definition of deadly force could have prevented the death of Mrs. Weaver by FBI sharpshooter Horiuchi.
Was Lon Horiuchi's second shot reckless?
Again, according to the Civil Rights Division, whose analysis I credit, that shot was not unreasonable, and that is the standard.
Would that shot be unreasonable under your new standard force?
I believe that under the new policy, we would train people certainly to hesitate much more with regard to that second shot.
So under the new policy, which was basically the standard policy, which was always in effect, absent rules of engagement, under the new policy, he would not take, in your judgment, he would not take that shot.
Under the new policy, I would like to think, given the training and the wording of the new policy, including the emphasis on imminence, that he would not take that second shot.
Tomorrow's Ruby Ridge hearing is the last one scheduled. FBI Director Louis Freeh will testify. Now the Ruby Ridge hearings. A Senate Judiciary Subcommittee today wrapped up its investigation into that federal siege in northern Idaho. The final witness was FBI Director Louis Freeh. Elizabeth Farnsworth reports.
In his opening statement today, FBI Director Louis Freeh acknowledged that the Ruby Ridge operation was seriously mishandled.
Ruby Ridge has become synonymous with tragedy, given the deaths there of a decorated Deputy United States Marshal, a young boy, and a boy's mother. It has also become synonymous with the exaggerated application of federal law enforcement. Both conclusions seem justified. We know today that law enforcement overreacted at Ruby Ridge. FBI officials promulgated rules of engagement that were reasonably subject to interpretation that would permit a violation of FBI policy and the Constitution, rules that could have even caused worse consequences than actually occurred, rules of engagement that I will never allow the FBI to use again.
Freeh condemned the rules, but angered some members of the committee by refusing to condemn Agent Lon Horiuchi, who shot and killed Vicki Weaver.
My judgment clearly is that it was a constitutional shot. That doesn't mean that it was a good shot. It can be a constitutional shot and a bad shot at the same time. But the very narrow issue, certainly the issue for me, and the issue for the Civil Rights Division that passed on this in a consistent manner, is that the shot under all of the Supreme Court tests is reasonably objective.
You've done a good job at the FBI. I think it's just a shame that you've gotten hung up and locked in to a story, not a story, but a position that Horiuchi evidently took on the witness stand, and is totally untenable.
The senators also questioned Freeh closely about his decision to promote his friend Larry Potts to the post of FBI Deputy Director. Potts had supervised the Ruby Ridge siege from FBI headquarters, and Freeh had censured him for improper conduct just before making him Deputy Director.
I would like to ask you directly if at this point you had it all to do over again, that you would not promote Mr. Potts to be Deputy Director of the FBI?
Yes, I would not do so. That was a mistake that I made, and my mistake alone.
He was in charge. He was the man in charge of the overall operation, which you have described as a terribly flawed, bungled, tragic affair. And from that point, he winds up getting promoted?
Based on my own personal experience with him and everyone else's, I moved to promote him. Maybe I did have a blind spot. Was he my friend? He certainly was. He is now. I still believed at the time that he was the best person to be Deputy Director. And obviously that was an incorrect decision, and I'm responsible for it.
But Senator Specter said Freeh was not the only person who erred in promoting Potts, insisting it was Attorney General Janet Reno's mistake as well.
I admire you for your directness in conceding the mistake, but I do not regard it as your mistake alone. My sense is that a dispassionate reading of this memorandum suggests that we have a highly qualified director of the FBI who has an extraordinary record as an agent and as a federal judge, who may have lost just a little perspective, and that somebody reading this memorandum would pause and say, we really ought to talk this over with Louis Freeh and really find out about it, and that the Attorney General of the United States is in that position to say no. She's not supposed to be a rubber stamp. Is the Attorney General supposed to be a rubber stamp?
Absolutely not.
California Senator Dianne Feinstein praised Freeh for promising to change FBI operations, but said she remained concerned about the Bureau's increasing use of military tactics.
This is deeply troubling, and Senator Abraham alluded to it, and that's the sort of ninja-clad, military-style, Vietnam jungle-style law enforcement methodology. And we are domestic law enforcement, you know, not Army or Navy or Marine Corps. And there's a difference, and there's a reason why there should be a difference.
I will not tolerate, and you will not have a militarized FBI or HRT in these operations.
I really appreciate that, because this may be the first day then of a brand new Federal Bureau of Investigation that the American people can, you know, continue to have a deep respect in.
The subcommittee is expected to issue its report on Ruby Ridge before Thanksgiving.